week later, during the inheritance meeting, he told me I had no place at the table. That's when I quietly called my lawyer. Follow my story to the end, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. I never imagined that after 45 years of marriage, I'd be standing outside St. Mary's Church like an unwelcome stranger, watching my husband's farewell through a pane of stained glass. My black purse trembled in my hands as tears slid down my cheeks. Inside, people were offering condolences that should have been mine to receive. "You can't go in there, Mother." Those words, cold and final, still echo in my mind. My only child, Dean, blocked the church steps, his tall frame casting a long shadow. "You don't deserve to be here after what you put Dad through." What I put Harold through? The accusation was so absurd it left me speechless. Yes, Harold and I had our storms, like any couple, but our love endured every one of them. Dean stood firm in his dark suit, his wife Cheryl by his side, with that faint, knowing smile. She whispered in his ear, and he nodded without even meeting my eyes. "Dean, please," I begged, my voice breaking. "He was my husband. I have every right to be here." "You gave up that right years ago," he replied flatly. "Dad told me things about how you treated him when no one was watching. Harold would never have said such things. They weren't true." But Dean looked convinced, as though months or years of quiet persuasion had hardened his heart. I could only watch as neighbors and lifelong friends slipped past me into the church. Some glanced at me with confusion, others with quiet pity, while Cheryl intercepted anyone who tried to approach. The September wind cut through my black coat. Organ music drifted out, the same hymns Harold and I once sang side by side every Sunday. Through colored glass, I glimpsed Dean delivering a eulogy I would never hear. It was the farewell Harold deserved, but I was forced to witness it from the cold sidewalk. I thought of all the nights I had spent at Harold's bedside, adjusting his pillows, holding his hand through restless sleep, managing his medications, driving him to appointments. I had been there for every difficult moment. Yet in Dean's mind, I had somehow become the villain. When the service ended, Dean and 5 of Harold's friends carried the casket out. I pressed against a tree, trying to disappear. Cheryl caught my eye as the procession passed, her lips curved in the faintest smile. I didn't follow them to the cemetery. I couldn't stand another farewell from a distance. Back home, Harold's scent lingered, his aftershave, the mint tea he loved each night. I sat in his chair and wept until I had no tears left. But beneath the grief, something else began to grow. Resolve. Dean thought he could erase me from Harold's life and rewrite our history. He believed he could humiliate me, and I would simply accept it. He was wrong. My son shut me out of my own husband's farewell, and a week later tried to erase me from the will. He didn't know the quiet plans Harold had made. Stay with me to the end, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Harold was always deliberate, a man who measured twice before making a single cut. As I sat alone in our silent house, his final words began to surface, phrases that hadn't made sense then, but now felt like clues. "Trust me, Opal," he'd whispered on a night when pain left him barely able to breathe. "I've made sure you'll be cared for." Dean doesn't know everything. At the time, I thought he only meant the usual finances, but after the humiliation of the funeral, those words pulsed with new meaning. Had Harold foreseen our son's betrayal? I was sure Dean would summon a meeting soon. Just as he had seized control of the service, he would want control of every dollar and deed. But Harold had guarded secrets through 45 years of marriage. Perhaps it was time for them to emerge. The call came exactly a week later, just as I was watering Harold's prized tomato plants. Dean's voice on the phone was brisk, almost icy. "We need to meet about Dad's estate tomorrow at 2. "At the house?" "Of course," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Bring any financial papers you have access to. We need everything handled properly." Properly. The word landed like a rebuke, as if I'd been careless all these years in the home I'd shared with Harold. That evening I went through Harold's desk, sorting bank statements, insurance policies, the house deed, every quiet document that makes up a life. My hands trembled as I filed them neatly, Harold's promise echoing. Dean doesn't know everything. The next afternoon, I arrived at what had once been my warm, welcoming home. Now it felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. Dean's luxury SUV and Cheryl's gleaming red BMW sat in the drive, along with a car I didn't recognize. I let myself in, calling softly, "Hello, I'm here." "Dining room," Dean answered, sharp and impatient. The space where Harold and I had celebrated birthdays and holidays now looked like a courtroom. Dean sat at the head of the table, his father's seat, paper spread before him like evidence. Cheryl perched to his right, perfectly groomed, her manicured nails tapping a silent rhythm. Beside them sat a middle-aged man with a briefcase. "This is Robert Chen, Dad's attorney," Dean said without preamble. "He'll guide us through the will and estate plan." I moved toward my usual chair, but Dean's voice froze me in place. "Actually, Mother, this meeting is for immediate family only." I stopped, hand on the chair back. "I beg your pardon?" Cheryl's cool blue eyes met mine, a flicker of triumph in them. "Dean means this is for people who truly have a stake in Harold's estate," she said smoothly. The words struck like a slap. "Harold was my husband," I managed barely above a whisper. Dean's jaw tightened. "Yes, and you made his last years miserable. Don't think we didn't see how you controlled him, how you kept him from friends, how you made him feel guilty for wanting time with his own son." Each accusation was another heavy blow. None of it was true, but Dean spoke with such conviction I wondered if he believed the story he'd built, or if this performance had been rehearsed for months. "Dean, that's not," I began. He cut me off. "This table is for people Dad actually cared about. People with rights here." The cruelty in those words stole my breath. I clutched the folder of documents tighter, feeling smaller than ever. Mr. Chen shifted uneasily. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he offered. "No," Dean said firmly. "Mother needs to understand her position. Dad may have felt obliged to stay married, but that doesn't mean she's entitled to what rightfully belongs to his son." Cheryl leaned forward, her voice sugar-sweet. "Opal, surely you see that Dean has been the one Harold relied on these past years. You have your own income. Dean has a family to provide for. Real responsibilities." Their words were meant to diminish me, but Harold's quiet promise still echoed in my mind. Dean doesn't know everything. I held on to that, the one truth that gave me strength as I faced my own child across that table. They thought they could erase me from Harold's life, but my husband had prepared for this moment long before his final breath. Real responsibilities, as if caring for a dying husband didn't count. As if 45 years of marriage could be brushed aside like dust. I turned to Mr. Chen, searching for a steady voice, some legal clarity that might break the tension. He wouldn't meet my eyes, clearly uneasy, yet unwilling to challenge his client's son. "I think you should leave now," Dean said, his tone as cold as marble. "We have important matters to discuss. Your presence isn't appropriate." For a moment I couldn't move. I stared at my only child, the boy I had raised, comforted, and loved without condition, and saw only a stranger who seemed to take satisfaction in pushing me out. "Dean." My voice was barely a whisper. "Goodbye, Mother," he said, final as a slammed door. I walked out of that dining room on legs that felt ready to give way. Behind me, papers rustled and voices murmured, dividing Harold's life as though I had never been part of it. But as I reached my car, something sharpened inside me. The haze of grief lifted, replaced by a quiet, focused strength. Harold had always been careful, protective in ways I sometimes didn't recognize until years later. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Through the window I saw Dean gesturing, Cheryl nodding, Mr. Chen taking notes. They looked so certain they'd won. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. One number was still saved there, a number I hadn't dialed in years. Harold's personal attorney. Not the family lawyer Dean had handpicked, but the man Harold had trusted for private matters. "Robert Morrison's office," came the familiar voice of the secretary. "This is Opal Whitfield," I said, surprised at how steady I sounded. "I need an appointment with Mr. Morrison as soon as possible." "It's about my husband's estate." "Of course, Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Morrison has been expecting your call." Expecting my call? My heart raced. Harold had been planning for this moment all along. Robert Morrison's office felt like a sanctuary after the hostility of my own dining room. The silver-haired attorney greeted me with warmth, his kind eyes a reminder of Harold himself. "Opal, I'm so sorry for your loss," he said gently. "Harold was a good man. He loved you very much. The simple truth of those words unlocked tears I hadn't realized were waiting. "Thank you," I whispered. "I'm confused about so many things. Dean seems to think." Mr. Morrison lifted a calming hand. "Before we discuss anything else, you need to know this. Harold visited me privately several times over the past 2 years. He was deeply concerned about certain family dynamics." Family dynamics, a careful phrase that said everything. "He knew?" I asked, though I already sensed the answer. "Yes," Morrison said softly. "He knew Dean and Cheryl were working to turn him against you. He knew they were spreading lies, hoping to damage your relationship for their own gain." Harold was heartbroken, but he wasn't fooled. Relief and sorrow surged through me at once. Harold had seen through them, but he had borne that pain in silence. "Why didn't he tell me?" I whispered. "Because he was protecting you," Morrison replied. "He believed that if you understood the full extent of their schemes, it would break your heart." And confronting Dean would have only made matters worse. Memories tumbled back with sudden clarity. The day Dean insisted Harold needed a new financial advisor, someone younger, more up-to-date. Harold had seemed hesitant, but eventually agreed, while quietly continuing to meet with Mr. Morrison all along. Cheryl's sudden fascination with family history, encouraging Harold to share childhood stories and old memories. At the time, it had seemed harmless, even sweet. Now I saw the strategy. Gathering information, looking for leverage. "They were planning this for a long time," I murmured. "Yes," Morrison said simply. Dean thought he had the last word, but Harold had prepared a final chapter none of them expected. "Harold began to piece it together about 18 months ago," Mr. Morrison explained. "Dean's visits became more frequent, but they weren't about father-son time. He was always probing, questions about finances, your health, your marriage. I pictured those quiet afternoons when I was at book club or running errands, while Dean slipped in with whispered concerns about my spending habits or supposed controlling behavior. Slowly, carefully, he'd tried to build a case against me. Harold never believed a word of it," Mr. Morrison continued. "But one accusation hurt him deeply. Dean claimed you were showing early signs of memory loss. He said you were making poor decisions and that Harold needed to protect himself legally." I drew in a sharp breath. "He said that?" "More than once," Mr. Morrison confirmed. "Dean urged Harold to rewrite his will, even create a trust that would leave you with almost nothing, framed as protection, as if you couldn't handle your own finances. The scale of the manipulation took my breath away. Dean hadn't only tried to turn Harold against me, he had tried to brand me incapable. But Harold saw through it," Mr. Morrison said firmly. "That's when he decided to act." He opened a drawer and placed a thick manila folder on the desk. Harold documented everything, every conversation, every suggestion Dean made, every lie Cheryl spread. He wanted proof before making his final decisions. My heart pounded. What kind of decisions? Harold created a new will, one Dean knows nothing about. He also set up financial safeguards to protect you no matter what. I stared at the folder, hardly daring to believe. Harold had known. He had prepared. As Mr. Morrison laid the papers across the desk, memories flooded back. The late-night phone calls I'd half heard, the quiet afternoons when he claimed to be resting, the soft click of his laptop keys, and the countless times he'd squeezed my hand and said, "Trust me, Opal, everything will be all right." Even as cancer weakened him, Harold had been working to secure my future. "There's more," Mr. Morrison said, his expression turning thoughtful. Harold left instructions on how and when to reveal all of this. He wanted Dean to expose his true character first. He believed you needed to see it for yourself. The wisdom of that plan was undeniable. If Harold had confronted Dean while alive, Dean could have hidden behind charm or excuses. Instead, he had revealed himself completely. "So what happens now?" I asked. Mr. Morrison's eyes warmed with a quiet confidence. "Now," he said, "we give Dean exactly what he asked for, a family meeting where every truth comes to light." He picked up the phone to arrange it. For the first time since Harold's diagnosis, I felt something close to excitement. Dean thought he had erased me from the story. Harold had already written a different ending. The second family meeting was scheduled for the following Friday, 2 weeks to the day after Harold's funeral. This time the call came from Mr. Morrison's office, not from Dean. I could imagine the confusion on the other end as the secretary's neutral voice explained. Mr. Morrison requests your presence to address certain discrepancies in the estate documents. During the days that followed, I lived in a strange calm. A small part of me feared some oversight might undo Harold's protections, but a stronger part felt steady and sure. Harold had loved me enough to plan for this moment. On Friday morning, I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit Harold always said made my eyes shine. I was ready. Dean thought he had silenced me. Instead, he was about to hear Harold's true last words. I wanted to walk in with my head high, calm, dignified, unbroken after the past 2 weeks. Dean's SUV and Cheryl's BMW were already in the driveway when I arrived, along with Mr. Chen's sedan and a car I didn't recognize. I unlocked the door, knowing it might be the last time I entered this house as someone with a rightful key. Dean was pacing the living room, face flushed with irritation. Cheryl sat stiff on the sofa, her usual confidence replaced by a thin layer of nerves. Mr. Chen hovered near the window, checking his watch. "What is this about?" Dean demanded the instant he saw me. "Some lawyer claiming there's a problem with Dad's will?" "Did you arrange this?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Dean strode over, and a calm voice introduced itself. Robert Morrison entered with a leather briefcase, followed by a young woman carrying a court reporter's equipment. "Good afternoon. I'm Robert Morrison, Harold Whitfield's personal attorney for the past 15 years. This is Sarah Chen, a certified court reporter who will document today's proceedings." Mr. Chen blinked. "I don't understand." "I handled Harold's will 6 months ago." Morrison's expression stayed pleasant, but his words were steady as stone. "You handled a will, Mr. Chen." Harold kept separate counsel for his most important documents. The only sound in the room was the soft clicking of the reporter setting up her machine. Dean's face drained of color. Cheryl gripped the sofa arm until her knuckles went white. "What are you talking about?" Dean asked, his voice suddenly thin. Mr. Morrison opened his briefcase and lifted out a thick blue-bound document. "I'm referring to Harold's true last will and testament, executed 3 months before his passing and properly witnessed and notarized." Harold was very clear. This will must be read only after certain behaviors were observed and recorded. Dean sank into a chair, stunned. "That's impossible." "Dad and I reviewed everything together. He showed me the will." "Yes," Morrison replied evenly. "He told me about those conversations and about your repeated claims regarding your mother's mental state, your talk of financial guardianship, and your doubts about her ability to manage an inheritance." The accusation hung in the air. Cheryl shifted, finally speaking. Harold was confused near the end. Medication? Illness? He didn't know what he was saying. Morrison's smile turned cool. Harold remained mentally sharp to his final day, confirmed by 2 independent medical evaluations he arranged specifically to prevent that argument. He began to read. "Harold was detailed," Morrison said, flipping a page. He wrote of the attempts to influence him, the lies told about his wife, and his disappointment in his son's character. Dean shot to his feet. "You can't be serious." "Dad would never cut me out." "You're correct, Wendertoss," Morrison replied calmly. "Harold did not cut you out entirely." He pointed to a line in the document. "To my son Dean, who showed me in my final years what kind of man he truly is, I leave the sum of $10,000. This reflects what he might have inherited had he shown his mother basic human decency." The silence was absolute. Dean's mouth opened and closed without sound. "That can't be legal," Cheryl said sharply. "A son has rights to his father's estate." "In this state," Morrison said, "an individual of sound mind may distribute assets however they wish. Harold's evaluations and meticulous documentation make this will virtually unassailable." He continued, "The remainder of Harold's estate, including this home, all financial accounts, investments, and personal property, goes in full to his beloved wife, Opal, who stood by him for 45 years and deserves far better than the treatment she received from her son." My vision swam. Everything. Harold had left me everything. But Morrison wasn't finished. Harold also included a clause regarding Dean's conduct. "Any attempt to contest this will, harass Opal, or interfere with her inheritance will void the $10,000 bequest, which will then be donated to the Cancer Research Foundation, where Harold volunteered." Dean stared at the floor, trembling with anger rather than grief. Cheryl sat frozen, no doubt recalculating every plan they'd made. "And finally," Morrison said, "Harold established a protective trust ensuring that Opal will never need to rely on Dean for anything. He stated explicitly that his son has forfeited any right to make decisions about his mother's welfare. The room stayed silent, except for the steady click of the court reporter's keys, preserving every word. Dean believed he had everything under control, but Harold's last letter turned the entire story inside out. The young court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word of the stunning scene. Everything Dean had assumed, every plan he'd made, every harsh word he'd thrown at me, it was all unraveling. There are also personal letters Harold left, Mr. Morrison said, drawing several sealed envelopes from his briefcase. One for me, one for Dean. He passed mine across the table with quiet respect. Dean's envelope he offered with noticeable reluctance. Dean snatched it and ripped it open. As he read, his face shifted. Disbelief, then anger, and finally, something that looked almost like shame. He knew, Dean muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He knew everything. Mr. Morrison packed his documents with the same methodical care Harold had always shown. The estate will be settled within 30 days, he said calmly. Opal will finalize the paperwork next week. Dean finally looked at me, really looked, for the first time since the reading began. For a heartbeat, I saw a flicker of the boy I had once loved so fiercely. Mom, he started, but the words died there. I stood, smoothing my skirt, feeling Harold's quiet strength around me like an invisible shield. Goodbye, Dean, I said softly. I hope one day you remember who you used to be. Harold had given me more than financial security. He'd given me the dignity of walking away on my own terms. That evening, I sat alone in Harold's study, his envelope resting on the desk. The house no longer felt like a place I was being forced out of. It felt like the home we had built together. Dean and Cheryl had left in silence, faces pale with shock. Mr. Chen had mumbled an apology and hurried after them. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with Harold's presence and his unwavering love. With trembling fingers, I opened the letter. My dearest Opal, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Not my passing, which we both expected, but Dean's betrayal, which I hoped might never come. I want you to know that I saw everything. Every whisper Cheryl fed to Dean. Every claim that you were failing me. Every attempt to use my final days against you. It broke my heart, but it also opened my eyes. Tears blurred the words as I read. I heard the phone calls where Dean said you were only staying married for money. I heard Cheryl hint that you were unstable, citing misplaced reading glasses, a forgotten plant, anything to paint you as unfit. They underestimated me. They thought a dying man wouldn't notice. They were wrong. Harold had documented it all, recorded calls of Dean planning to manage Mom after Dad's gone, screenshots of text messages between Dean and Cheryl, even photos of financial papers Dean had tried to access without permission. This isn't about money, Harold wrote. It's about respect. It's about ensuring that the woman who loved me for 45 years is never destroyed by those who should have protected her. Then came the revelation that stole my breath. Dean doesn't know that I was aware of his plan to keep you from my funeral. Cheryl sent him messages about keeping you away from the church so they could play the grieving family and paint you as unstable. I have copies of it all. Even in his final days, Harold had known they intended to keep me from saying goodbye. The knowledge filled me with a sharp, clean anger, but also a deep sadness as the letter went on. What hurts most isn't their greed. It's their willingness to wound you to get what they want. Dean was a good boy once. You were a wonderful mother. But somewhere along the way, he chose another path. Cheryl exploited his weaknesses, but the choices were his. Harold had included photocopies of the messages, Cheryl referring to me as that old woman, mapping out how to control the inheritance once Harold was gone. I set the letter down, my hands shaking. Harold had not only protected me, he had revealed the truth in a way no one could deny. Even in death, he gave me strength, clarity, and the final word. Dean believed he could still bargain his way back, but Harold's final words and my own resolve made sure the story ended on my terms. Among the copies Harold had left were messages from Dean that froze me where I sat. Texts where he called his dying father dramatic and complained about the obligation of visiting. Notes where he calculated inheritance amounts and wondered aloud if Harold was taking too long. I lowered the letter, heart heavy. This was my son, the baby I once rocked through fevers, the little boy who'd made crooked-hearted Mother's Day cards in crayon. The final page of Harold's letter was the hardest to read. I know you're wondering if you failed as a mother. The answer is no. Dean made his own choices. You gave him love, guidance, every opportunity to be a good man. What he did with those gifts is on him, not you. I'm leaving you everything, not just because you deserve it, but because I trust you. Live the life we dreamed of. Travel, buy books without checking the price, take that art class. Be generous to those who show true kindness. And if Dean ever comes to his senses, forgiveness is yours to give. Or not. You owe him nothing. I love you more than words can say. Always and forever, Harold. I pressed the letter to my chest. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythms. Families gathering for dinner, children being called in from play, couples strolling with their dogs, while my own world quietly shifted. My phone buzzed, a text from Dean. We need to talk. There has to be a way to work this out. I stared at it, then deleted the message. Harold had been right. Dean still thought everything could be negotiated. Another text followed. Mom, things got heated today. Maybe we both said things we didn't mean. Dad was influenced by his illness. We can contest this, but it's better if we work together as a family. As a family. Even after everything, he still used that word like a lever. I turned off my phone and walked through the house that was now truly mine. Each room felt wrapped in Harold's love, finally free of the shadow Dean and Cheryl had cast. Tomorrow Dean might call again, maybe even appear at the door. Tonight, I was free to grieve Harold honestly, to remember our life together without the weight of betrayal. Harold had given me far more than financial security. He had given me the truth and the power to shape my own future. 3 months later, I stood in the empty living room of the house we had shared for 32 years, watching the moving truck pull away. The sale had been quick. Harold's careful upkeep and my own touches had made it a home that young buyers coveted. The new owners, a couple with toddler twins, had fallen in love with the garden and the big kitchen, where Harold and I once lingered over countless meals. It felt right that the house would again ring with the chaos and joy of a growing family. Harold would have approved. In those months, Dean tried to reach me 17 times. Calls, texts, even a formal letter from his lawyer, threatening to challenge the will despite Mr. Morrison's warnings. Each attempt grew more desperate as the reality settled in. When his lawyer finally filed a contest, the $10,000 bequest Harold had left him was forfeited, just as the will specified, and donated to the Cancer Research Foundation. They sent me a kind note about establishing a small memorial fund in Harold's name. I never responded to Dean. What more was there to say? Harold's letter had made everything clear. Dean's own actions had revealed who he chose to become. The boy I once knew was gone. My new home was a bright one-bedroom apartment in a community called Sunset Gardens, about 40 minutes from the old neighborhood. This wasn't a place where life slows to a stop, but a lively setting with art studios, gardening plots, and a weekly book club. I chose the largest unit with a small balcony overlooking the community garden. The walls glowed a warm butter yellow, like the kitchen in our first apartment. I furnished it with pieces that carried good memories and left the rest behind. Harold's photograph sits on the mantel, surrounded by small treasures of our life together. A seashell from our honeymoon beach, a pressed flower from our 10th anniversary picnic, the little wooden bird he carved after retirement. And on this morning, a brochure lay open on the kitchen table, an invitation to something new, something I never imagined I'd have the courage to begin. The end of one life chapter can become the beginning of another. Here's how I finally stepped into my own. A European river cruise, 15 days from Amsterdam to Budapest, drifting past castles and vineyards. Harold and I had dreamed of that journey for years, but there had always been something in the way. Dean's tuition, his wedding, house projects, then Harold's illness. We kept saying next year until there were no next years left. Now I was going. Alone, yes, but not truly alone. I carried Harold's love with me and his clear wish that I live the life we had planned. The phone rang as I checked my packing list. I almost ignored it, but the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Whitfield? This is Sarah Chen from the community newsletter. We're featuring new residents. Would you like to be included? I hesitated. Since moving here, I'd kept to myself, not ready to explain my past. What would that involve? I asked. Just a short interview about your background, your interests, what brought you to Sunset Gardens, so neighbors with similar hobbies can connect. Her voice was warm, inviting. I realized I was tired of hiding. All right, I said, I'd like that. The next afternoon, Sarah arrived. Kind eyes, easy smile, notepad in hand. We sat on my balcony with tea and the cookies I'd recently learned to bake, a small joy I'd never had time for before. "So what brought you here?" she asked. I chose my words carefully. I was recently widowed. After 45 years of marriage, I needed a new chapter, somewhere to make friends and rediscover interests I'd set aside. That must have been difficult. "Do you have family nearby?" The question I dreaded, but looking at her genuine face, I decided to answer honestly. "I have a son, but we're not close." I've learned family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who truly care. Sarah nodded with an understanding that hinted at her own story. "What are you most looking forward to?" I felt a smile spread, the first easy one in months. Travel. I'm finally taking that river cruise Harold and I always dreamed about. And I've signed up for watercolor classes. I used to paint when I was young. That sounds wonderful. Any advice for others starting over? I thought of Harold's letter, his words urging me to live fully. "Don't be afraid to begin again," I said. "Don't let expectations or judgments hold you back. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters start when you think the story is ending." After Sarah left, I watched the sunset over the community garden. Residents were gathering for evening social hour, their laughter floating up to my balcony. Tomorrow night I'd join them. It was time to stop hiding. My phone buzzed again, another message from Dean. More attempts to reconnect to work things out as a family. I deleted it without reading and blocked his number for good. Some might call that harsh. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting continued harm. Love doesn't mean tolerating disrespect, and family doesn't give anyone the right to destroy your peace. I opened the travel confirmation for my cruise, excitement fluttering in my chest. In 3 weeks, I'd be standing on the deck of a riverboat, watching Europe glide by, eating meals I didn't have to cook, sleeping in a bed someone else would make. For the first time in my adult life, I was answerable only to myself. Harold had protected me in death as he did in life, ensuring my later years would be filled with dignity, security, and choice. Dean had revealed his true character, and while that knowledge hurt, it also freed me from the endless effort to repair what couldn't be fixed. As night fell and stars appeared over Sunset Gardens, I raised my evening tea in a quiet toast to Harold's memory, and to the unexpected gift of starting over at 73. Tomorrow I would begin packing for Europe. Next week I would start watercolor class. From now on, every day would belong entirely to me. It was, I realized, exactly what Harold had always wanted. Now I'm curious about you. What would you do in my place? Have you ever faced a turning point that set you free? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And when you're ready for more true life twists, stay tuned. 2 of our most surprising stories are waiting on the screen right now.